There's something unsettling about certain people. You know the feeling. You walk away from a conversation and something feels off, wrong, somehow. Like you've been in the presence of someone who operates by entirely different rules than the rest of us. Maybe it was the way they talked about themselves, or how they seemed to view other people. Perhaps it was the cold calculation behind their eyes, or the complete absence of genuine remorse when discussing harm they'd caused. You might be thinking of a narcissist, or maybe a psychopath. But here's where it gets interesting. These aren't the same thing, not even close. Most people use these terms interchangeably. Hollywood doesn't help. Neither does casual conversation, where we throw around narcissist and psychopath like they're different flavors of the same psychological disorder. But the reality? The psychology behind these conditions reveals two fundamentally different ways of being human. Or perhaps, two different ways of struggling with humanity itself. Let's start with what's obvious. Both narcissists and psychopaths can be manipulative. Both can seem charming on the surface. Both can leave you feeling used, confused, or emotionally drained. But that's where the similarities end, and the fascinating differences begin. See, narcissism is fundamentally about an unstable sense of self. Picture someone whose entire identity depends on external validation. They need to be seen as special, superior, important. Not because they genuinely believe it deep down, but because without that constant reinforcement, their entire psychological structure starts to crumble. The narcissist lives in a house of cards. Every interaction is an opportunity to either build that house higher or watch it collapse. This is why they react so explosively to criticism. It's not just hurt feelings. It's an existential threat to their carefully constructed self-image. But psychopathy? That's something else entirely. The psychopath doesn't have a fragile ego that needs protecting. They often have quite stable self-regard. The difference is in how they experience other people. Where narcissists see others as mirrors to reflect their own importance, psychopaths see others as objects, tools, things to be used towards specific ends. You might know someone like this. They can be incredibly charming when they want something, but the moment you're no longer useful, you simply cease to exist in their consideration. Not out of hurt or anger, but out of genuine indifference. Here's where the psychology gets really interesting. These conditions develop from different places and manifest in completely different ways. Narcissistic personality disorder often stems from childhood experiences where love and attention were conditional. Maybe the child was only praised for achievements, never for simply being themselves. Or perhaps they were alternately idealized and devalued by caregivers who couldn't provide consistent, unconditional regard. The developing mind learns a dangerous lesson. Worth equals performance. Love equals being special. And if you're not constantly proving your value, you risk becoming worthless in the eyes of others. This creates what psychologists call a false self. The narcissist becomes expert at presenting whatever version of themselves will generate the admiration they desperately need. But underneath, there's often a profound sense of emptiness, a core self that feels inadequate, shameful, unworthy of love. Psychopathy follows a different developmental path. Research suggests a strong biological component. Brain imaging studies show differences in areas responsible for empathy, fear processing, and moral reasoning. The amygdala, which processes emotional responses, often shows reduced activity. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control and conscience, may be structurally different. This isn't to say psychopaths are destined by their biology. Environment matters too. But where narcissism often develops as a psychological defense mechanism, psychopathy appears to involve fundamental differences in how the brain processes emotional and social information. Do you see the distinction? The narcissist desperately wants to connect with others, but only knows how to do it through manipulation and control. The psychopath often has little genuine desire for connection at all, viewing relationships purely through the lens of utility. Let's talk about empathy, because this is where these conditions really diverge. Narcissists can feel empathy, but it's conditional and self-serving. They'll show tremendous compassion when it makes them look good, or when they can identify with someone's pain because it mirrors their own experience. But ask them to genuinely consider how their behavior affects others, especially when those effects conflict with their self-image, and you'll often hit a wall. It's not that they can't feel empathy. It's that their empathy is hijacked by their own psychological needs. They might cry at movies, feel genuine sadness for suffering animals, or show real concern for friends going through difficult times. But this same person might devastate someone emotionally and struggle to understand why their victim doesn't just get over it. Psychopaths present a more complex empathy picture. They often understand empathy intellectually. They can read emotional cues, predict how people will react, even mimic appropriate responses. This is called cognitive empathy, and psychopaths can be extraordinarily skilled at it. But emotional empathy, the actual feeling of another person's pain, that's often severely diminished or absent entirely. They might watch someone suffer and understand perfectly well that the person is in pain, but they don't feel that pain themselves. It's like being colorblind to emotional experience. This creates individuals who can be remarkably effective at manipulation because they understand human emotional responses without being burdened by them. They know exactly which buttons to push because they've studied human behavior like scientists studying lab rats. Here's something that might surprise you. In relationships, narcissists and psychopaths create entirely different types of damage. The narcissistic relationship often feels like an emotional roller coaster. There are highs when you're providing the validation they need, when you're reflecting back their grandiose self-image. During these periods, they can be incredibly attentive, generous, even loving. But the moment you fail to meet their psychological needs, or worse, challenge their self-perception, everything changes. You'll experience what psychologists call narcissistic rage. Not just anger, but a kind of fury that seems disproportionate to whatever triggered it. Because you're not just disagreeing with them or disappointing them. You're threatening the very foundation of how they understand themselves. The psychopathic relationship has a different quality. There's often an initial period that feels almost too good to be true. They seem to understand you perfectly, to be everything you've been looking for. This isn't accidental. They're skilled at identifying what people want and becoming that thing. But once they have what they want from you, whether that's sex, money, status, or just entertainment, the mask begins to slip. Not dramatically. Often so gradually, you don't notice until you're already deeply involved. You start to realize that the person you fell for might not have existed at all. The manipulation styles differ too. Narcissists manipulate from a place of desperation. They need your admiration, your validation, your reflection of their importance. Their manipulation often has a frantic quality to it, especially when their self-image feels threatened. Psychopaths manipulate from a place of calculation. They're not emotionally invested in the outcome the way narcissists are. If one manipulation tactic doesn't work, they'll smoothly shift to another. If you become too difficult to manipulate, they'll often simply move on to easier targets. But here's what's really crucial to understand. Neither of these is a choice these individuals are making. This isn't about good people deciding to be bad. These are deeply rooted psychological patterns that developed for complex reasons and now operate largely outside conscious control. The narcissist isn't choosing to have a fragile ego that requires constant maintenance. They're not deciding to react with rage when their self-image is threatened. These responses feel as automatic and necessary to them as breathing. The psychopath isn't choosing to lack emotional empathy. They're not deciding to view others as objects. This is simply how their brain processes social and emotional information. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior. Understanding isn't the same as accepting or enabling, but it does help explain why these patterns are so resistant to change, and why traditional approaches to conflict resolution often fail spectacularly with these individuals. You might be wondering about treatment. Can these conditions be addressed? The answer is complicated. Narcissistic personality disorder can sometimes respond to therapy, but there's a catch. The person has to genuinely want to change, which requires acknowledging that their current way of being isn't working. For someone whose entire psychological structure is built around being superior and right, this admission feels like psychological death. Some narcissists do eventually seek help, often after experiencing major life consequences, or during periods of what psychologists call narcissistic collapse, when their false self can no longer be maintained. These moments of crisis can sometimes create openings for genuine self-reflection and change. Psychopathy is even more challenging. There's limited evidence for effective treatments, partly because psychopaths often don't see their condition as a problem. Why would you want to change something that gives you significant advantages in manipulating others and achieving your goals? Some research suggests that intensive, long-term therapy focused on practical consequences rather than emotional insight might help some psychopaths develop better behavioral controls. But cure? That's probably not realistic, given our current understanding. Now let's talk about something important. How do you protect yourself? With narcissists, boundaries are crucial but difficult to maintain. They're experts at finding ways around boundaries, at making you feel guilty for having them, at presenting situations where enforcing boundaries seems cruel or unreasonable. The key is understanding that their emotional reactions to your boundaries aren't your responsibility. Their rage, their hurt feelings, their accusations that you're being unreasonable, these are predictable responses to having their psychological needs frustrated, not evidence that you're doing anything wrong. With psychopaths, different strategies apply. Don't expect appeals to their conscience or empathy to work. They might understand intellectually why you want them to behave differently, but they're unlikely to be motivated by how their behavior affects you emotionally. Instead, focus on consequences they actually care about. Legal consequences, social consequences, financial consequences. Things that impact their practical goals rather than emotional appeals that assume empathy they don't possess. But here's something we need to acknowledge. Most people with these conditions aren't dangerous criminals. They're your coworkers, your family members, people you date, friends of friends. They're struggling with fundamental difficulties in how they relate to themselves and others. This doesn't make their behavior less harmful when it is harmful. But it does suggest that our approach shouldn't be simply to demonize or avoid these individuals entirely. Instead, we need better understanding of how to interact with them in ways that protect ourselves while not unnecessarily escalating conflicts. Because here's the thing, whether we admit it or not, we all have narcissistic traits. We all have moments of using others for our own ends. The difference between having narcissistic or psychopathic traits and having these personality disorders is largely about degree, persistence, and the extent to which these patterns interfere with relationships and life functioning. Understanding these conditions isn't just about identifying them in others. It's about understanding the full spectrum of human psychological functioning, how we all struggle with self-worth, how we all sometimes prioritize our own needs over others' well-being, how the line between normal self-interest and harmful manipulation isn't always as clear as we'd like to think. So what's the real difference between narcissists and psychopaths? Narcissists are drowning in their own emotional needs and pulling others down with them. Psychopaths are swimming calmly on the surface while remaining largely indifferent to whether others sink or swim. Both can cause significant harm. Both represent genuine psychological conditions, deserving of understanding rather than just judgment. The goal isn't to become amateur diagnosticians. It's to develop better understanding of human psychological complexity so we can navigate relationships more skillfully, protect ourselves more effectively, and perhaps develop more compassion for the full range of ways people struggle with being human.